Welcome to the Responsible Bytes podcast, everyone, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today I'm joined by Dr. Art Cotterell from UNSW. Well, welcome to the podcast, Art.
Thank you so much, Zena. It's lovely to be here, and definitely going to enjoy talking.
I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. I know we've been trying to set this up for a while now, so it's great to finally have you on.
Definitely, and as they say, like a long time listener, but a first time caller to Responsible Byte. So it's I think it's a really, as we were talking about earlier, it's a really great platform for people to be able to come and talk about technology in an accessible way, and also just bring it down to, well, what does this mean for us, the everyday person, not just what's happening within industry or government.
I think so too. And it's actually the reason I asked you on the podcast, because there is a word I have seen floating around, and I want you to break this down for us and to explain what it means. So the term is nuclear renaissance. I have been seeing nuclear renaissance everywhere. So can you explain for us what nuclear renaissance means and why we are now seeing this word floating about?
Yeah, happy to. And you are correct. We're seeing it in a lot of like headlines, or we're seeing it in different sorts of speeches by politicians globally as well, or different international institutions. We're seeing it for quite a number of reasons. So one is this increasing turn and talking about nuclear power in all different sorts of ways. So I suppose one thing that's really good to clarify is what I'm going to be talking about is nuclear power for civilian purposes or commercial purposes. And certainly not nuclear weapons. So that's a very big and separate topic. But what we are seeing with regards to civilian use cases for nuclear power is very much around what's driving this Renaissance talk is, well, we need nuclear power as part of the transition, the net zero transition. And in particular, that's also come out of COP. So a couple of years ago, there was a declaration that came out of COP talking about we need to...
Can you just quickly explain what COP is in case people are not familiar with the acronym?
Yeah, so it's actually like it meets periodically to actually bring together national governments, industry, civil society, observers to actually talk about climate change and what is being done around climate change, and to actually track how we are progressing in response to, I suppose, the worsening case of climate change, what the science is saying, but also what measures could be taken as well. And I should also
So
say
it's
it has
through
that.
this forum that we've been hearing about nuclear.
Yeah, and not just this forum, but I suppose I'm focusing on that because it's one of the main, like you might see in the newspaper, COP said that we're, on track in terms of not meeting our target, or other sorts of headlines. And so it's actually, there was a declaration that came out of that, and that also fueled subsequent discussion that's happened within other international fora as well. And so it was a declaration around tripling the output of nuclear energy capacity by about 2050, which is that net zero target. And one thing about it, I would say, is that it wasn't just led by like major powers like the US, for example. We also did see a number of countries from the global south, or the global majority, that were part of that as well. And so using that as an anchor point, it is very much being framed in terms of this sort of decarbonisation agenda. But it's not the only reason why we're seeing nuclear in the headlines as well. We've also seen it enter the headlines in terms of, well, if countries have their own nuclear power plants, for example, well, that could provide more energy security instead of being dependent on importing a fuel from overseas, for example. And very much about, some countries have framed it, well, if we went down a nuclear energy path more, well, then we could stabilise costs, stabilise availability. And it's also framed, again, I always am careful to say some countries, but not all. This is also a quest to have the sort of energy sovereignty and reduce that dependency on other nations. I would also say, I mean, when we talk about, I'm sure you've seen it in the sort of work you do with respect towards like sovereignty. Also, what does that look like in terms of the whole supply chain? Like, where does the uranium come from? It's not just having the nuclear power plants. Another reason we're seeing it enter the debate, or discussion, I should say more, is we've seen obviously nuclear power in space talked about, and that's been generating a few headlines which can seem very science fiction and also far removed from our everyday reality of needing to pay bills or navigate a very fraught international landscape. Is whether nuclear power and reactors on the moon, to power bases on the moon, or also for that sort of what's, as I said, far-fetched, but is far-fetched, may seem far-fetched, but the aims of interplanetary travel as well, to go on to Mars. And just to throw it in,
I think this year has made everybody realize that far-fetched is not that far-fetched. I think the events of 2026 have just opened our minds to what is actually possible.
Yes. And I think increasingly too, like everything that may have seemed unprecedented every day, it seems a new unprecedented event. But
I think unprecedented needs to be the word of 2026. You know how every year they pick what the word was? It needs to be unprecedented.
Or it should be the cancelled word as well, so we don't have to hear it again. But yeah, I say far-fetched because it like that I think is often the everyday perception of the public as well. I just even read this morning, like Japan, for example, is looking at restarting its nuclear power plants, rebuilding, I should say, its some of its nuclear power plant infrastructure with this view towards reaching its decarbonisation goals, but also in terms of this sort of energy security language that's floating around at the moment. But with space, I should say, like there's definitely plans for nuclear propulsion to Mars, for example. But it's also with respect to, as I said, nuclear reactors on the moon. And so we're seeing nuclear turn to in terms of the language because it's considered. We'll get to the safety elements in a minute, but definitely considered more efficient. Or, for example, on the lunar surface, you've got 2 weeks of daylight, 2 weeks of darkness for a lunar day, for example. So how are we going to power any sort of activities there? The other thing I would also say why it's entering, I mentioned space, not just because whenever you mention space, it becomes like the instant conversation around the so-called water cooler or dinner table, but also because it's these new nuclear technologies that are sending the topic into the headlines as well. So there's a new type of nuclear reactor which hasn't been yet commercially proven, or the technology hasn't developed at the place that it would need to, but are called small modular reactors, which are, as the name suggests, much smaller, more compact and factory built. So you could think of them as a bit more like this is an oversimplification, but a plug and play type reactor than the ones that we're used to seeing photos of. And so those are the sorts of reactors that are also driving this so-called nuclear renaissance, I should say. The other thing I would just,
is it Renaissance or is it Renaissance?
You know,
is this like a tomato situation?
Like it is. And so initially I was going to say Renaissance, then I'm like, no, that's probably just me mispronouncing. And then you said
Renaissance. I said Renaissance.
And I was like, I'm going to run with this. So any listeners out there, we would really, this is actually the hot topic of this podcast, so we'd be very much.
Is it Renaissance or Renaissance?
Yes.
Please weigh in. I might put a poll in the bottom of the episode.
Also data or data as well.
It's data. It is 100% data. Also, this is completely tangential, but I love when I'm in international forums and everyone says data, and then you can just pick the Australian out of the group when they're like, data.
Well, that's better than what I do, which is like, depending on who spoke last, I'm like, I should really flip how I just pronounce that word. But
I just want to be in line with everyone else.
I know. But all jokes aside, like also this talk around nuclear power as well, is that just those sorts of high energy demands, and part of driving that is very much just talk around AI data centers as well, and the huge energy footprint that they have, which obviously raises a raft of ethical issues, legal challenges, and we're seeing it as one of those very big discussions and debates and controversies at the moment. So it's certainly driving that. But I was going to say, I'm just thinking about the Renaissance, but I think there's something to be said about it in all seriousness. Like, we hear this language and it suggests like, oh, well, new ideas are flowing, new technology, new art, etc. So it's trying to, I think, also evoke a period that might have a lot of, I suppose, artistic expression or techno-utopian perspectives attached to it. But I don't know. I also think when we look back at that part of history, it wasn't all good. And we also see within Europe, like, I think it was a time too of colonial expansion to other countries and the colonial harms that followed, particularly across the African continent, or new types of warfare were developed. And so I don't know. Whenever I hear the term, I often think, well, yes, it had these good elements about it, but actually, there's some lessons to be learnt from that as well. In that it also um, that period also perpetuated harms that many countries are still, or continents are still living with to this day. So, yeah, always there for the balance with how the language is used.
Well, language and narratives are a very powerful tool, aren't they? And I think the reason that nuclear renaissance is kind of having its moment
Mm,
is because
mm, mm.
it's a positive
Yeah,
description of what they want
yeah,
to push forward,
yeah.
which is kind of going back a little bit, because it is a little bit of a step back, right? We moved away from nuclear energy and nuclear power for a while, and we're kind of stepping back into it now. And I think framing it as a nuclear renaissance is a more positive and kind of alluring
Mm,
framing,
yeah.
as opposed to saying, oh, maybe we should go back to the way we used to do it before.
Yeah, and I think there's also something to be said about that. Like you were saying, oh, we hit pause, so to speak. We didn't hit pause fully, but there were a whole range of reasons why nuclear power started to fall out of being such a dominant source. Like we did see, for example, after World War II, there was this idea, well, how could we actually brought the international community together? Like, how can we actually use international power? And it was like to humanize the atom, so to speak, was the phrase, because it was this was actually very much, again, quite a number of global South countries that were saying, well, actually, nuclear power would very much help with like our development agenda that we have, and to actually get the sort of energy that we need for our populations. But as with any sort of technology, there's many different stories and experiences with it. And we did see, and I think this is often in people's minds when it comes to nuclear, like we saw the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident in the Ukraine. We saw Fukushima in Japan, obviously 3 Mile Island in America. And so that had an impact on industry as well. Whole other reasons did too, but particularly within public imagination, imagery, that had a huge impact. And when
Is
we
it
talk
worth the risk?
and I think that's one of those debates and discussions that particularly people are having at the moment. And so one thing to think about, because often it can go, well, I don't think it's necessarily, I'm thinking about the language, like, oh, is this a step back? I think it's actually, since then, there has been, and nothing is ever a complete project, but nuclear safety laws and regulations and standards have increased and strengthened dramatically. And that is what is also important to ensure that we don't erode in this new nuclear expansionism, so to speak. And because those nuclear safety standards and laws were developed through, really hard fought lessons where in the example for Chernobyl, people did lose their lives. So what can we actually learn from that? And also the technology has developed or is developing as well. So that's also why in some ways it's not a step back, but I think how can we, if we go forward with this nuclear expansion, how can we actually learn from the past and with these new technologies that are being developed? And also, how do we make sure that we balance these sorts of public and private interests and in the quest for profit, not erode any sort of safety standards that, as I said, were developed through lessons that, yeah, just had a really material impact on people and the planet.
So we're seeing a greater nexus between nuclear and AI, and it's something you very briefly touched on. Can we unpack that a little bit? And I want to unpack it from this perspective of the safety standards that
Yep.
you're talking about. So
Yeah.
the current AI industry is advocating for the absence of regulations, because they don't want to impede innovation, and it's the tired old tale. And I'm curious how that kind of conversation lands in the context of nuclear when we have things like what you were saying. We have Chernobyl and we have 3 Mile Island. So, how does that conversation land in the context of nuclear when we have that intersection with AI?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it also helps to just take it back just a little bit, if you don't mind, to what we're even talking about with nuclear safety as well. And so, if we look at nuclear safety, well, what are we thinking about, and what are we looking to protect? And we're looking to protect, like, obviously the workers that are in these plants, so people, surrounding communities, that's the public. Also looking to protect the environment. I would also say that we also should be looking to protect future generations as well. That should, and any sort of technology, I think that should be part of the safety nexus. And also, I think part of that nexus, it might not get the sort of attention it deserves, but sometimes what are those communities that are really on the border of facing the most risks from technology, and how to actually amplify those voices. And that goes to with nuclear safety, like nuclear safety, when we think about it, it's about essentially regulating or thinking about safety across the context of the entire, what might be called the nuclear fuel cycle, and different aspects of nuclear material, nuclear activities, and nuclear facilities. So that might go to ensuring nuclear safety from the point of licensing and construction right through to endpoints like the actual waste management or decommissioning, or even like emergency preparedness and response is a huge part of that as well. And so I think that's why I like lingered a bit on talking about those sorts of international nuclear laws that developed post those particular, the nuclear incidents that are emergencies that are very much in our mind, like Chernobyl and 3 Mile, because we did see like new treaties develop on early notification so that international assistance could occur. Surrounding territories could find out if there was something that had happened. We also learned from the sort of human error that had occurred through those sorts of incidents, and we had subsequent treaties as well that developed, including a treaty on the Convention of Nuclear Safety as well. So so you've got nuclear safety over here, which you've got your treaties that have developed, and I just named a couple there. And you've also got these things called safety standards, nuclear safety standards as well. A lot of them come out of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and those nuclear safety standards, you could think about them about like technical standards, or you could think about them like best practice approaches as well, and they combine both of those. And so you've got that sitting there. And one other thing that you've got thrown into the mix as well, and I think this is important to say before we get to the AI data centers, is the reason why I keep saying, well, yes, we've got all these activities and nuclear expansion that occurs, and I'm not an anti-technology person. I don't know, do you find that if you sometimes raise the how can we do this responsibly or how can we do this safely, that there might automatically be the impression that, oh, I'm anti-technology or I'm against this or I'm against that. But I actually,
Absolutely. I find that. And I find, like you, I always have to include a caveat, or I feel like what I'm about to say is not going to be heard. And so I
yeah,
have to include this caveat that says, I'm not anti-technology,
yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
anti-progress,
yeah.
but
Yes, and that's how I am with pretty much all technologies. And I think it's because we can very much learn from the past and see how if we don't get things right to begin with, and also give communities and the public a chance to be consulted and involved in process and genuine consultation and involvement, things can go really badly wrong. And also, we've just got to learn from history as well. So, with respect to the data centers, like that is something that is very much coming up, because what we're seeing is in terms of like the huge energy demands for the data centers. We've seen companies like Microsoft. I think it's Microsoft that's investing in 3 Mile Island. We've also seen Amazon looking to develop nuclear powered data center, Google as well. Some of those have actually abandoned those plans in recent times because of the opposition that's been received from
interesting.
surrounding communities, because I'm sure you've seen that the huge energy demand and how it actually can transfer that sort of energy need, like meeting the energy needs of the local communities to the data center, and then the impact on the water supply, obviously has local communities quite concerned. Is that something that you've come across as well in how
Absolutely,
your
especially
AI
because
forums?
Australia, so the US has taken it and run with it. They've already got their data centers up and running. They've got a lot of community cases of impacts to their water, impacts to their power, and not just impacts to accessibility of the water, also impacts to the quality of
Yeah.
the water, which is a huge
Yeah,
issue.
yeah, yeah.
And we're seeing it now in Australia as well. The difference between Australia and the US, though, is Australia has been quieter about data center development across the country, even though we are well and truly underway. We have up and running data centers in this country, but we've been a lot quieter about them. And I will say that I think Australia is a bit more strategic, that when we do talk about data centers, they talk about renewable energies in the same vein as they talk about data centers. But I'm not convinced that that is being addressed in the way that it needs to be addressed. And I don't think that, especially in Australia, like where we are with renewable energies is not far ahead enough to
Mm,
meet the demands of these
mm,
data
mm,
centers. So it's
mm.
kind of the chicken and the egg a little bit.
Yeah. Definitely, and communities, as you said, also have those concerns around, well, what's the impact going to be on local water supply or local energy supply, or could it even drive up energy costs
Hmm.
as well? Um, yeah, within Australia, I think there's actually going to be a federal inquiry that was announced recently around data centres, and we've seen obviously a New South Wales inquiry as well. And then with the data centers, like you said, the renewable energy hasn't actually quite caught up in terms of being able to, putting aside the fact actually whether we should even like go down this path of having these mass data centers, the energy
The
repel.
decision's been made, right?
Yeah,
This is the thing of what you were talking about with community consultation.
yeah,
There is no community
yeah,
consultation. The decisions for the data centers have been made. And what's interesting is Australia is not exactly a country that is known for pursuing renewable energy. And yet when the conversation of data centers came up, suddenly renewable energy was the hot ticket item.
yeah,
And I found that really
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, like the two being tied together.
Hmm.
Um, and the two being tied together actually, I think, raises something interesting about nuclear. But before I get to that, like with the data centers, we have seen, like, for example, they've been very much based out in communities, like within New South Wales. They're looking to base them out in communities in Western Sydney, and that's led to quite a lot of talk and protest and opposition from local communities. And I think this goes to like this question of responsibility as well, and like whose voices are heard in that. When we look at Western Sydney, and this is been said by actually a scholar over at Macquarie Uni, Dr. Tamika Worrell, who's been looking at Indigenous sovereignty with respect to AI, but saying, well, placing data centres at Western Sydney, like who are the demographics? And particularly, I think quite a few of the data centres are looked to be placed around Blacktown. Who are the communities there? And it's often like migrant communities, or it's communities that are like Indigenous communities, and that's where the data centers are looking to be based. And so there's community opposition there, but also not just within Western Sydney, anywhere where it's been discussed. I think communities feel like this is happening quite rapidly without that sort of
It
being
is.
involved in the sort of consultation that and genuine consultation that needs to occur and work with communities versus this, we've just got to get things built and built quickly.
And, for our international listeners, Art kind of touched a little bit on the demographic of Western Sydney, but Western Sydney versus Eastern Sydney are significantly different
Yeah.
demographics. And that is the reason why data centers are popping up on the west side of the city and not on the east side.
Yeah. And I think like some people might say, well, because there's more land, so to speak, available in the West. But I still think that it's different communities are seen as, well, we could place this in with this particular community. But I think going back to also like the well, how this is actually being regulated or what's happening with respect to it and how that nexus is with nuclear. What we do see is within the US, for example, earlier this year, it was I think it was NPR, the national broadcaster, had actually expressed concern that the directives that were coming out from the relevant nuclear agency had been revised in terms of without community and public consultation to enable regulatory approval more quickly for these new nuclear power plants to be built. And there was concern, well, is this reducing safety standards, for example? Because there was some change in the language where it was, instead of like must protect, say, groundwater, it was give consideration to groundwater um, to
Which are
protect
two
the ground.
very different things. So I work in the regulatory space, as you know, and back to the point of language being very
Yeah,
important.
yeah,
Language is very important. And one of the main distinctions in the language we talk about in the regulation space is the distinction between must and should. Must is a definitive term. You must do this. There is no yes, no, maybe. Should is
yeah.
encouraged. There's a very big difference between
There
must
is,
and
and
should.
that's what definitely. So it was NPR, which like I think like a public broadcaster that had got access to these documents before that actually been published, and that actually led to quite a bit of backlash and concern, understandably, because they hadn't gone through community consultation, and also seeing these sorts of shifts from must to consideration. And also, if I recall correctly, there's also when there's an official accident that occurs or radiological um, exposure that occurs, it had, in terms of that sort of reporting for workers, it had been reduced down. So I think it was like if the worker exposure was at like 2 times the legal radiation dose back in the day, that needed to be reported. But I think it had increased or it has to be like 4 times the legal dose. So there was these concerns about protection to the environment, which also has an impact on local communities, and also protection to workers as well.
Just a question on the protection to workers. So they've
Yeah,
gone from 2 to 4. Is there any scientific justification for why?
it's a good question, and that's something that I personally can't speak to. But in terms of the justification with um, reducing what was seen by some as like regulatory red tape, because regulation often gets a bad rap. It's like, oh, it's red tape, it gets in the way. But I I also think if done properly, it can actually be a really important enabler and provide certainty, and particularly if it's been developed in consultation properly with communities and with industry, and not run through some very rapid time frame. But the justification towards moving to more streamlining some of these regulatory processes, or reducing some of the what were considered by industry as more onerous requirements, was because it would enable faster approval processes for new power plants, and also that would help with testing new reactor designs as well. So you might recall I said part of this renaissance. I'm now going to like it's like an either
Tomato,
or.
tomato.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, was this view? Well, that's like remember those advanced nuclear reactor designs that I was talking about, that are considered haven't been proven yet, but are considered like more safe potentially. So that was also part of this, I suppose, modernization, because it was like, well, some of these rules are outdated for where the technology is, and we need to modernize them. But it does leave the question, particularly for the public, which is like, well, why weren't we consulted on them? And why did this feel like it was rushed through as well? And like industry says, well, the technology has developed, and also this will help with investment and so on and so forth. But I keep coming back to, how do we actually do these sorts of, whether it be new regulations, whether it be regulatory reform, like how is it actually done in a way that people want transparency, and they want, whatever the policy change is on, people generally, and local communities that are directly affected, like materially affected with their day-to-day lives, want to know the implications, want to go to their community town halls or what have you, not to actually talk about it. And so again, with my like not anti-technology hat on, but there's a way to try and do things properly. And sometimes communities might outright and go, you know what, I don't want a power plant here. I don't want a data center here. And it might be controversial to say, but that is actually okay. And that is the process of consulting with communities and seeing, well, maybe like where are the locations that communities do want this? And if we think about some of these advanced reactor designs, the small modular reactors, because these are more portable, so to speak, they're built in a factory. I'm simplifying it, but they don't have to be custom built on site. Some communities that are in more regional and remote areas, I'm talking globally, we haven't, like, not talking about the Australian context, have actually expressed interest in that technology as providing more energy security for them, so they're not dependent on other power sources, and particularly countries where, we have where renewables aren't as much of an option. So again, within a community, and this is also something that sounds very like, well, obvious, but I think communities, it's important to have that, say, for public and private actors to work together and actually find, well, if you're going to do this, where is it actually going to get support? How is that process done in a way where people can actually have input? And in the Australian context as well, that criticality of like free, prior and informed consent for Indigenous communities who might be affected as well.
Which is definitely an under-researched area, and an area just not given the consideration that it needs.
No, and I think sometimes those voices that might seem um, like not heard as much are often with like the arc of history, so to speak. the arc of history actually turns to hearing them and going, actually, we should have listened to those voices all along. And actually, what was being said is something that would have been beneficial to all. Um, so I think that's really something that needs to factor into these sorts of discussions as well. And it's actually about doing things, going to what, like the framing for this podcast, like responsibly and safely as well. And I think whether it be AI, whether it be nuclear, whether it be space, whatever the latest technology or the emerging technology area is, that's how we need to do it.
So you've mentioned three areas: AI, nuclear, and space, and there is actually a connection between all three, and it's space-based data centers. Can you unpack for me a little bit this idea of space-based data centers and how realistic this idea could be?
Well, first, actually, tell me what you know about space-based data centers or orbital data centers or infrastructure.
So, okay, here's a caveat, right? I'm not a conspiracy theorist. This is
But I'm just going to say something that sounds exactly like a conspiracy theorist. I feel like this whole podcast could be us with like 10,000 disclaimers as well.
I tell you what, so I've never really been a conspiracy theorist, but I am someone who does really enjoy reading a good conspiracy theory because I'm somebody who believes that there's a grain of truth in everything. I have seen a lot about the space-based data centers. Now, there's the grain of truth side, so the side that seems pretty reasonable, and then there's the really outrageous side. The grain of truth side is the idea that continued development of the data centers on Earth isn't great, right? It uses a lot of water, it uses a lot of power, it requires a lot of land. And so space-based data centers make sense from that both environmental and economic perspective. I get it. I don't know if I agree with it, but I get where that's coming from. The other one that I don't think there's a grain of truth in, and this is where you can lend your expertise, is people talking about space being a lawless entity or a lawless area. And that's the reason why they want the data centers or space-based data centers, because it's lawless and they won't have regulations and safety standards imposed on them. That's the one that's not actually grounded in reality. So can you unpack that a little bit around this misconception of space being a lawless area, and then what it would look like to have space-based data centers?
I think we often hear this with new technologies as well, like, oh, well, even in terms of these, for people that might not be aware, like these new nuclear technologies, like small modular reactors, for example, people might be like, oh, well, these are new technologies, laws don't apply, etc. Who are new because it's this idea, well, technology never keeps pace. And so therefore, if there's a new sort of technology, it's not going to, the laws aren't going to keep pace. But one thing I would say, and I think this is really important, is that with nuclear technology, like we do have nuclear, what's called nuclear safeguards, which is about non-proliferation and preventing the diversion of nuclear materials into nuclear weaponry. And we also have like nuclear safety that we've been talking about and nuclear security as well. And so it might sometimes seem like, well, the technology, like laws don't develop, but that's why I was talking a bit about those sorts of safety standards as well. And this will feed into the space discussion as well, because we do have these sorts of standards, like those sorts of best practice technical standards that provide principles or actually like requirements that engineers and so on actually implement on the ground. And we're actually seeing discussion at the moment with these sorts of, say, small modular reactors within the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is over in Vienna, where international community comes together to discuss nuclear technologies. That's a very oversimplified way to talk about it. But they are actually looking at this question right now of like, well, okay, we've got these new sorts of nuclear technologies developing. How can we actually try and improve the safety standards and actually strengthen them and look at harmonizing these sorts of standards as well? And so considering small modular reactors are seen as more serial production or built in a factory versus on site, they lend themselves more to standardization too. So I think one thing to think about is that there's all different sorts of laws. It might be your treaties, it might be domestic regulations. Then we also have these things which are, I think it was the World Standards Day said, "A tiny but mighty," which, or maybe that was myself that said that, and now I'm trying to attach authority to it by saying it was the world's one of the World Standards Authority.
World-renowned scholar once said.
But yeah, it was actually World Standards Day that said it, not the World Standards Authority. So I'm just like making up authorities now. But in any event, they are, all jokes aside, like incredibly important, and they've been foundational to nuclear ever since like the late 1950s onwards, how we actually do this in a safe way. And so when we now think about space, like standards are also incredibly important to space. And actually in the AI space generally, like we're not seeing new treaties develop. We're not
No.
seeing, we've seen some sort of domestic legislation binding, or we've seen the EU's AI Act, but it actually is at that standard setting level where it is developing. Well, it's been discussed more so. So, with respect to space-based data centers, that was a long detour with a lot of pit stops. But I really want to also convey not just my, like, to make sure I'm not anti-technology, but also it's not all, the law is just completely not catching up. But we already do have infrastructure, like treaties in place around nuclear safety, for example, with respect to this new technology, nuclear safeguards. We've got these sorts of standards. And so that also applies to space. So with space, like you said, people might say space is lawless, or we've got, say orbital data centers, there's going to be no laws, absolutely nothing there whatsoever. And while I'm hesitant to say like the laws that we do have are going to answer every single question in every single scenario that we do actually have like foundational treaties and principles that developed from the Cold War era, which still stand today. And we also have like a patchwork, albeit of like domestic laws that are developing. And then we do have different degrees of standard setting that are emerging as well. So, and not to mention commercial contracts, which are a form of regulating behavior between different parties. And one other thing I think to think about is sometimes we might have laws in place and an activity goes ahead, and sometimes we might not have laws in place, but there's public will towards an activity. And then we see, say, like politicians responding and supporting a new area because the public wants to see something happen in that space. But with respect, so that's me saying like a way to even regulate is to also think about how the public responds to these sorts of concerns. And we've certainly seen more attention given to this idea of space debris and space junk as a result of public concern, environmental concerns. And that, so with space-based data centers, they're not entering a lawless space
No.
at all. But of course, that, and if anything, they nexus with a whole different range of treaties and regulations as well. So whether that is with respect to satellites, whether it would be respect to space traffic management, which is something that really does need more development for governance. It's not entering a lawless area. But why are we even looking at this? You were right talking about, well, it's been pushed as this idea, well, it's more environmentally friendly. I personally have reservations around that because of the idea that, well, actually it would add to the amount of objects that would be in orbit. And also we already see that the proliferation of space junk in orbit has just already increased. And we also need to see like who are the actors that are driving this as well. And so you've probably seen that space does not begin and end with Elon Musk. It certainly doesn't begin and end with SpaceX as well. However, that is certainly a big driver. And so that is something that SpaceX is looking at doing, putting these data centers into orbit and saying, well, actually, if we put them in orbit, the satellites could actually capture nearby, like could be solar powered, could capture they would be above the clouds, therefore not impacted by weather. They could get that sort of solar power. That's how they could actually be powered. Also, cooling wouldn't be such a big issue as well, is one of the claims too. But we also, as I said, this is, I think, tied up as well with SpaceX's upcoming IPO as well. So we know with SpaceX, like, you've heard of Starlink, which is the mega constellations that circle around. So SpaceX has the satellites already. It also has as well its Starship, like its launch capabilities too. And so what it hopes to do with this IPO, some have said, well, actually the part that is more profitable of the business is actually the satellite constellations, the Starlink part. But SpaceX wants to enter into more providing the in-orbit data centers. And so it actually needs more funding to actually be able to do that. And so that's also the part that hasn't actually occurred, isn't profitable yet, but would need funding to occur. And going back to what we were talking about initially, like, is this far-fetched? And it's actually not, because I think it came out this week that SpaceX is actually seeking approval from the US regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, for essentially satellites in orbit to run these sorts of data centers. And the numbers that are within that approval process that are being sought, I will fact check this, so make sure you can add a note if need be, but I think it's like up to 1 million satellites, which is absolutely, like,
It's insane.
but it doesn't mean that that number is going to be put up there. When we look at the number that Starlink does have up at the moment, I think Starlink has about, I don't know, 9,500 or that. So it doesn't mean that many. It could be an
Yeah.
ambit claim, so to speak, but
But it's
that would
kind of
then,
an untouchable ceiling, isn't it? It gives them free
well, yeah,
range.
it doesn't mean as much going back and getting constant
Yeah.
approval processes. I mean, there still would be approval processes, but I think this is something that needs to be thought about, because it is one private actor and obviously tied to a potentially multi-trillion-dollar IPO. That, what does that actually look like? And if we're already having these issues around space-based data centers on Earth, and communities are understandably having reservations, like, we all have a relationship to space. And I know, like, Dr. Cassandra Steer likes to say, like, we're all space citizens, so to speak. But
Let's give Cassandra a quick plug here. For those who don't know, she does have a blog on Substack called Space Citizens, which is absolutely fantastic.
yeah, and it goes to this idea, well, we should all care about space and the activities that occur there, and therefore all be involved in how it's governed and how it's regulated. And I think those are wise words that should apply to all areas of technology. It's more about how does the everyday person find their way in. But the thing with SpaceX actually entering this as well, which would be that to transport orbital data centers into space is going to require a pretty significant, like, powerful rocket. And that is something that SpaceX is the one, like, the company that's closest to actually developing with its Starship. And so if SpaceX controlled the Starship, which would be the rocket, sending the payloads up into space, it has the Starlink, the satellites, and then it has the actual orbital infrastructure. That means it would be controlling, like, a huge amount and different steps in, I suppose, the AI infrastructure supply chain. So I think we also need to think ahead about that as well. And I also am concerned that people have, like, the everyday person, to quote Gil Scott-Heron, who was a civil rights activist, a black activist from America during the civil rights era. He actually wrote this poem called Whitey on the Moon, and he's like, I can't pay my doctor's bills, but Whitey's on the moon. And that was
It's an
this.
infamous poem.
It is, and I
Yeah.
often think about it, because this is still, I think, how a lot of people feel about space as well, like the everyday person. And so if we've got this opposition to data centers on Earth overall, and, like, let's think about Australia. I think there was an article by Cam Wilson in the ABC this week saying, like, it was one of the big four consultancies, I think, like EY, saying Australia, out of 23, 28 countries, actually ranks, I think, right down the bottom in terms of communities having really negative perceptions and don't trust AI and all that's attached to it. And so if we've got those sorts of perceptions with AI, we've already got, like, there's been some research done from the Australasian Centre for Space Governance and United States Study Centre and others talking about attitudes towards space. Like, the general public doesn't already have a great awareness of how we're dependent on it in terms of our everyday lives, checking our phones, paying our bills, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that resistance to it. And then we throw up space-based data centers, and people have resistance to data centers on Earth. Well, I just think it's going to attach itself as these technologies converge to people going, well, again, why space is just for the billionaires, or I don't want that in space because actually that's going to cause environmental harm or disrupt astronomy or disrupt the connections for Indigenous communities throughout the world, which I think those are real concerns. So I have reservations, which might not be a popular take on the idea of space-based data centers going
But
up
it's
in the sort
valid,
of
right? And
number.
something to remember as well is it is environmentally taxing to do space-based research and to
Mm-mm.
send things to space. That
Yeah.
doesn't just happen in a vacuum. it is environmentally taxing. So if we want to use the argument of the impact to the
Yeah,
environment, and that's the reason we need space-based data
yeah,
centers, we also need to have a parallel conversation around what is the actual environmental impact of sending things to space.
yeah.
It's not insignificant.
No, and it's also, I think this goes to this idea of, I always think about, well, what are the implications generations into the future, and how do we, and well, intergenerational equity, for example, and how do we actually do things responsibly and properly and not get ahead with this quest for profits or speed or even strategic advantage, so to speak. And particularly with AI data centers, like, yeah, you've already got a huge amount of objects in space. We've got space traffic management not being comprehensively resolved, far from it. There's also obviously cybersecurity risks, there's liability, and I won't even go down the path of, like, space technology and the association with dual use or dual purpose technology. So I think there is sometimes this sense that we just, of FOMO, oh, it has to be done and it has to be done yesterday. But I think there's a lot to be said with taking our time sometimes, and regulating and thinking about these properly and bringing communities along. And in the meantime, really thinking about how we are using AI and the big footprint, and are these large language models the best way to harness, if we are to use AI, to harness AI. And I know, I'll just say this because I actually think it's a really good book. I'll give a plug for a book called The Empire of AI. Have you heard of that? By Karen Howe?
Uh, I have. I think so. Karen Howe's book is
Yeah.
very popular. I personally have not read it yet.
Yes, it's look, it's a thick book. I'm just looking at it, and, like, it could break your toes. So, you'll probably need time away to read it. And if you're on holidays, you're probably not going to want to read about AI since it's your job. But within that book, though, she says, like, look, if we are going to go down this path of using language models and using AI, well, actually, why is this large language model where you've got to be able to jump onto ChatGPT or jump onto Claude and be able to answer every single question possible? It is that which is driving the energy demand. Like, I think it was OpenAI Altman who said something like, oh, every time someone says thank you, that's like using $5 million a day, not every single instance, but overall is using, like, not just $5 million, but water supply and what have you not. So can AI be, and maybe, the ship has sailed on this, but can AI actually be used in a way that could be, say, smaller language models that have targeted use cases and are done properly? Like, we are seeing that in areas of medicine, looking where some medical researchers have been looking, well, how could AI be used to, with privacy requirements all in place and patients being informed, but how could AI be used to also detect cancers, or or differentiate them earlier on scans, or tumors that the human eye can't detect? And so there's all these smaller use cases, and these sorts of smaller use cases wouldn't have the huge energy demands of the current large language model approach, which then would lead back to this question of, well, do we actually need these actual massive data centers? Because it's really about powering all this huge energy consumption.
So, we have come to the end of our podcast today. So, I'm going to ask you the final question that I ask all of my guests, which is, what is one piece of advice you would give to people for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So, what is your one responsible bite?
My one responsible bite would be, I think, don't I think for us, we need to think about, there is a role for technology, but it's not this techno utopian fix. It's not going to solve all our issues. The whole reason why we've got climate change and we're looking for these other alternatives is because of consumption, is because of, at times, like, capitalist greed and expansion. So we can't just see it as a panacea. And that means, how do we actually, I think my one thing would be, like, how do we make sure that whatever new technologies come out, that whether it's the everyday person, I think, needs to look at, well, how can they get more involved in the everyday decisions they make in their life to try and use these technologies responsibly without expecting themselves to be pure? How do governments actually make sure that they do proper consultation and have that sort of, and regulatory independence? And then for industry to go, well, actually, it's for their own benefit to work with communities in the long term. So my one takeaway would actually be this need for proper engagement and proper working with communities, and not feel like, well, this needs to be done yesterday, but actually take that time and see what is actually needed. How can we do things in a way where it's actually going to benefit generations to come, not actually harm them?
That's wonderful advice, Art, and a lovely place to end our podcast on. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Honestly, I could have spoken to you for hours, not just about AI, space, and nuclear, but also about conspiracy theories. But anyway, you've been amazing to talk to. Thank you so much, Art.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And yes, of course, looking forward to chatting about all things AI, nuclear, and space and conspiracy theories
We'll
offline
have to have
too.
you on for another episode
Yeah.
just to really unpack all of those.
See you. Bye.
Thank you.